Yeah, I'm back reading Baudrillard, and I have to say it's a pretty impressive text that I have to go over and over again to really understand what he does. Definitely not a clear analytical text, but let me summarize again. So he starts with talking about ethnology turning into anti-ethnology. That simply means that once ethnologists have discovered some folks that were never touched by civilization in the Philippines in 1971, they decided to protect them. They became like mummies in the open air, as Baudrillard says. And this is a transformation into anti-ethnology because they don't want to discover the object anymore, and by discovering, destroying it, they now want to preserve the object so that ethnology does not investigate it anymore. So from here, we discover an interesting mode of simulation, namely the simulation of an indigenous culture that now is preserved and produced in capitalism. In a sense, there are savages that have to be preserved but by virtue of that preservation, their savage status is actually produced. So it is not independent from our culture anymore. And he goes on to discover this kind of technique in the so-called museumification of our society, where we produce more and more of such protected spaces. He also says that this is pretty similar to how science operates, which I don't see entirely. And then he comes to the final lesson, the vengeance of the dead. And that was really difficult for me to understand, and I had some questions about that. And I think that towards the end of this paragraph, we will understand what he finally means by that. So he then comes to the example of Ramses II. So what is Ramses II about? Well, somehow it expresses our mobilization of sciences in order to not conserve another culture, but somehow to tell the history of our culture as a linear developing culture that accumulated the views of the past. But he thinks that this myth of getting towards this great culture is actually ending in a simulation that will be heavily criticized, and we are going on to read more concretely from here on. So he says here, in a very interesting way, we require a visible past, a visible myth of origin, which reassures us about our end. That seems to be a fairly simple criticism about the nature of ourselves, that we kind of a drive towards, or not a drive towards death, that we have an anxiety about death where we ultimately search our meaning. So, but then he asks quite interestingly, but why do we want to rediscover Ramses? Because he was a great despotic and military figure? So he makes fun of it, right? Ramses was actually not worth to be conserved in a certain sense. But he says, yeah, okay, well, I mean, maybe we admire that. So he's a bit ironic here. But then he writes, but mostly because our cultural dreams, and now we have here the topic of dreams again, and we mentioned that actually before. I don't know if you remember. I will go back to the passage. Behind this defunct power that it tries to annex, of an order that would have had nothing to do with it, and it dreams of it because it exterminated it by exhuming it as its own past. So somehow, what he writes here, it is related to something that is our dream. It is an order that we want to somehow reestablish, or we want to have an order. Let's look very concretely in the sentence here. But mostly because our culture dreams. Okay, our culture tries to be something else in dreams. And why do I say the dreams are here important? So he said that we try to dissolve ourselves from the organic order, which has a clear succession, to an order of psychology. And he said before, okay, but this also has an order, so there we can distinguish madness. But he says, well, dreams are beyond that order. So dreams is another kind of reality that is more, I believe, a simulation and a simulacrum. Dreams don't refer to an underlying reality. I think this is his point. So, and here he somehow says our culture is more and more moving towards a collective dream state. So, and then he says, okay, it tries to annex a defunct power. That, I mean, he's a despotic military figure that makes no sense, or maybe it makes sense because we are also encapsulated in a democracy of defunct powers, maybe. But then he says, well, our culture dreams of an order that would have had nothing to do with it. So with what? With the defunct power, right? And it dreams of it because it exterminated it by exhuming it as its own past. So it kills something that is not, let's say, godlike by, exhuming what he says here, the past, and it hopes that it thereby kills its past. But this is probably not possible, and he comes right after this, comes up with a further example. He discusses how the Renaissance Christians discovered the American Indians and wondered, are they actually human? Are they actually human? And they had two choices, right? So why is it so problematic, first of all? Because somehow they have to accept that the law of the gospel was not brought to these wild people, which makes no sense, because the gospel, the word of God, is what frees you. How can all of these people, I mean, that's how I explain his example to myself, how could all of these examples just been placed in nature without never having, how do you say that in English? Without never having had, without never being in the position that they could have heard the word of God. That makes no sense. He says there were two possible responses. Either admit that the law of God is not universal, or exterminate all Indians. And he says, well, we didn't decide ourselves to exterminate them. We conserved them, which assured ourselves that we are better. So this is also part of the museumification. And what happened now to these indigenous people, if I understand him correctly, he says they die from being transplanted from a slow order of the symbolic, master over purification and death, to an order of historic science and museums, our order which no longer masters anything, which only knows how to condemn what preceded it to decay and death, and subsequently to try to revive it with science. So this here is a pretty good description of what is going on in the text, right? So what's the important point? I tried to say that again in my own words. It's so much, and there are so many ways Baudrillard takes, but it is definitely interesting. So as I understand it, we don't accept the death of other cultures. We don't accept the savages. We don't accept things just dying, and we want to absolutely control it. And so we museumify it. That's how he calls it. And by that, however, we lose the contact to reality, because we just start reproducing what is already there. And that is his major criticism. So he comes up with other examples in that regard. The cloister of Saint Michel de Cuxa, which was reinstalled in its original site, or the experimental campaign to take back the sidewalks of the Champs-Élysées. And he thinks all of this copying mechanism is a total simulacrum that links up with reality through a complete circumvolution. So he says instead we should just let things die. So also in the case of the claustrum, because that would have at least not fooled anyone. And then he finishes how our museumification, by showing how our museumification actually leads to contrary results, which are related to the certain structure of capitalism that we live in. So for example, our culture, by preserving these civilizations, is superior, and it produces more native people, more Indian people. And he says that's overproduction, and it is again a mean of destroying them. Because their tribal culture rests on limitation, on a certain kind of scarcity, while capitalism tries to get more of that available, and by that destroys its value. And we see these mechanisms at work, and he thinks that leads to a specific result of where we live, which he describes in the following way. Everywhere we live in a universe strangely similar to the original. Things are doubled. So yeah, the museumification leads to the fact that we start copying things. And you see that especially in the age of the internet. I mean, this text, when was it written? In the 70s? But now we are copycats. All of us are copycats. And also the originality that he provides in this text anymore, that's not necessarily true for sciences anymore. That in a sense just copies what has already been there, just to progress further with what is understood as science today. The problem is that this doubling does not signify anything. It is different from what was the tradition. So the sign does not point to reality anymore. And that reality was originally the death. Death was the original reality. Nothing. Nothing was meaningful. And now, he says, they are purged of their death. They are stolen of their death, these indigenous people. And now we have better indigenous people that are more cheerful, more authentic in the light of their model, like the faces in funeral homes. So when we see the faces, I mean, it's hard to understand, maybe I misinterpret this here, right? But when you see the faces in funeral homes, they look so happy, so authentic. They look better as the person has ever lived, but they are not real. And I think this is what our culture has come to. Not what I think, I'm sorry, what Baudrillard thinks our culture has come to. So this turned out to be a rather difficult chapter. I don't know what you think. Do you think I got the points right? I maybe next time will read a summary just to make sure that I'm on the right track. All these examples, all these interesting observations make it, of course, hard to follow the text in a linear way. But I have to say it's good because it helps my intuition to look at the world in another way, which an analytic text that spends a lot of time on structuring would probably not do. Here I can read 10 minutes and I have a great outcome for myself. So if you enjoy that, then like the channel, like this video, like, share, and subscribe, and all these things. And as I said, this year has no economic purpose in the first place. Of course, we all have to earn money, but I don't intend to do that with this channel. This is just for educational purposes, to read classics of the philosophical world literature together and trying to understand them. So please join me for that journey leave some comments, and don't copy too much. Bye bye.